Hello, this is the second video in this series. So this is looking at building the Proton pack. If you haven't already seen the video looking at building the neutrino wand, I suggest you watch that first because that shows a lot of the techniques that I've used for this as well. So throughout this video I'm going to be using these terms like ion arm and cyclotron and these are terms that are generally adopted online for the elements of the Proton pack. I don't know if they're official or not. So this ion arm is like an electric shower element from a broken electric shower. Basically it's a load of copper coils in sort of a fairly chunky sort of copper pipe almost. So that was for the ion arm, which is up in the top left corner. So now looking at the windows for the cyclotron. So this is the four lights you see on the back, which I had the idea of doing as like fireboxes, and putting the lettering on them using this plastruct lettering to say ectoproof, which is a bit of a take on how you often get sort of old light fittings from factories and that say explosion proof on them. So for Ghostbusters, making them ectoproof sort of makes sense. So these, I built a master from MDF and plastic and bits like that, then took a mould off it. I used bathroom sealant for the mould. I wouldn't advise anybody do that. This is basically because I built this during lockdown and at the time I couldn't get the silicone moulding compound. It does work, it's just the moulds don't last as long, they're not as neat, not as nice to use. The resin's just a 2-part polyurethane resin, and it takes some very nice casts, which you'll just see me break out just here. So the actual main part of the cyclotron is built out of a Cadbury's Miniature Heroes tub, which I'm just priming there. I have already sort of roughed it up with some sandpaper so that the paint will key to it properly. I'm just using some car primer. The backboard is a piece of plywood. I think it's about 8mm plywood. So I'm just working out sort of a layout there based on some photographs of the pack and some drawings I've got, and then deciding where to cut this down. So just cutting it down with a handsaw, and then looking at the back part of the cyclotron, which is a piece of expanded polystyrene insulation, so it's like some Kingspan board cut out to shape that. Then we're just sort of wrapping that, in this case with some lining paper and then with some foil tape just to smooth the surface off. Now if I was to do this again, I'd probably paint it with resin instead. It was a technique I wasn't aware of at the time. So yeah, just chopping up some lumps out of that to put some blocks of ply into there so that I can attach the connection to the neutrino wand. So then we're just sort of shaping up, well, marking out to shape the bottom of the motherboard, which I'm doing just using compasses and a square. Cutting out with a scroll saw. You don't have to have a scroll saw, you could do it with a jigsaw, you could do it with the handsaw if you wanted. Now this is what I say about the same techniques. This again, it's that sanding off the red face of the plywood and then staining it with dark oak wood stain to make it look like oak. So again, back to the surround for the cyclotron, this piece of polystyrene that I'm now adding some squares of cardboard to, and then this will just sort of build up some texture and some interest on it. So you can sort of see some sort of something like this on the Proton pack, but as I say, this isn't a replica Proton pack, this is a steampunk take on a Proton pack, so I'm not trying to get something that's accurate here. I'm just trying to get something that's sort of unmistakably a Proton pack from the shape. Now rivets I'm doing using the technique I've used many times before that I find works very well, which is these pearlescent embellishments. So these are 10mm pearlescent embellishments that I generally buy them from the works. You can get them sometimes from Poundland as well. They're £1 for a pack of 70. I say by far the easiest way to do rivets. So this is the drilling out the bottom of the cake tub now. There's a whole separate video on problems I was having with that pillar drill, which I will link in the in the description if I can. So now we're doing the crank generator, which is sort of the box which is up on the top right as you look at the pack. It has a little hand crank on it, which is, I assume, why they call it the crank generator. Now what I'm putting into this is I want some exposed mechanism inside. So what I'm doing is I'm carefully dismantling a clock mechanism. Now I photographed it all before I did this, and sort of so I could reassemble it. So I'm then just sticking it in white vinegar to fetch the corrosion off. Once I'd done that, I then polished it up with Brasso, then rebuilt it, which was a very painstaking process which I didn't bother filming, and then I could obviously motorise it with a drive belt. Now, again here we're now looking at the actual crank for the crank generator, which is a clock spring housing, and the handle from a little hand drill. Again, just polishing it up with the polishing wheel on the Dremel to get a sort of nice high shine to it, and then mounting that onto the rest of the crank generator, which is just, again, it's just plywood built up in layers. And now we're building up another little plywood box. Now if you've seen the Neutrino wand video, you'll be familiar with the technique, but if you haven't, I'll just go over it. So I'm cutting out the pieces of plywood, then PVA gluing them and nailing them together. So yeah, just putting some PVA glue there on it and then nailing it together, punching the nail heads down below the surface so you don't see them. Then I will probably put some filler in over the nail heads, then do like a final sand over it, which in this case will take that red face off that bit of plywood. So I think we now go to me doing the final sand on it after it had dried. So this was probably a day later. So yeah, that's taking that off, and then again the rusting's dark oak wood stain, and then I use some clear lacquer over the top of it. So now just assembling that, just holding it in place temporarily with tape, drilling, countersinking, adding some screws, then adding a hinge. Now the hinge is so I can get into the crank generator box, because that's where I'm going to hide the power bank that's going to run all the electrics on it. All the electrics on this are 5 volt, they'll just run off a power bank. So just a little hinge there so that can lift up. So we've now sort of put a few bits together on the motherboard. We're assembling the cyclotron, adding the ectoproof windows, adding rivets. I think I used a smaller, possibly a 6mm rivet on this. Just adding them round, again, just to get that boiler effect, which you'll start to see as I paint it, which is the next sort of stage with this. But yeah, so adding the rivets, gluing everything down, priming it here again in the spray booth. Well, I say in the spray booth, out of the spray booth because it didn't fit. Then we're mixing up there. This is how I've done sort of cast iron effect stuff in the past. So it's a mix of black and silver. So the black's to give like a cast iron colour, and then the silver's just to give that slight bit of sheen to it so it looks like metal. Now I'm putting this paint on very thick, and that's because I'm trying to build up texture at the same time, because I want a sort of a bit of a rough sort of cast iron texture to this if I can. But it just helps to just sort of make it look that bit more real. Now I think I put a couple of coats of this on in the end, just to make sure it was a nice even finish and a nice sort of dark colour. So then I go in and was dry brushing on like the same thing, but with like a bit more silver added. So this is just to try and highlight some of the high spots on it, some of the rivet heads and that kind of thing. And just going around with that, around the whole thing, just to make it, again, it just gives it that sort of cast iron, monolithic sort of boiler look, a bit like sort of your Lancashire boilers like you get in sort of Papawick pumping station or a big old factory or whatever. Now the other thing to make it look like a boiler is I want to add boiler cladding, which I'm doing using lollipop sticks, which I'm just cutting them down here en masse on the scroll saw to get them to the right length. So cutting down a lot of them really to just get the lengths that I need, because I need a lot of them to go around this. So then I'm sticking them down to a piece of double-sided tape on a bit of scrap timber, and this is just so I can stain them en masse. not get quite as much stain all over my fingers as I would doing it another way. So just going at them again with 2 coats of Rustin's Dark Oak Wood Stain, which will just help blend them into the other things that are covered with the same sort of stain. So like the motherboard and the neutrino wand and the crank generator. So again, that's now all dried, and I'm sticking them onto the cyclotron with just a bit of contact adhesive. Worth checking if you're sticking things with contact adhesive to plastic. Now this isn't a problem because it's got such thick paint on it. Contact adhesive will react with some plastics and sort of melt it. So it's worth bearing in mind if you are going to use contact adhesive for something like this. Now with this, I say it wasn't a problem because the paint was so thick on it. But yeah, then we're adding sort of like the copper bands, which you'd often see either copper or brass bands sort of holding the timber in place on these boilers. Now I'm just using sort of a thin copper tape and putting it on like double thickness to make it look like a sort of nice heavy copper band holding all the cladding in place. Once all this was done, I then clear lacquered the whole thing, so that brings a nice sheen to the wood and stops the copper corroding. Now we're adding the backpack sort of elements, which I've used some pieces of oak dining chair because I was trying to build this during lockdown without going out. I had some broken bits of oak dining chair in the garage, so that's what I used. They're back shaped, it made sense. Unfortunately, it does add quite a bit to the weight, but this was never going to be a light build, what with all the brass and timber on it. Now, what I don't show on this video is I did end up adding some padding to these, using some carpet underlay and then some leather over the top just to make it comfortable to wear. It is actually quite considering how heavy it is quite a comfortable pack to wear. It's a lot more comfortable than my jetpack, which is far lighter, and that's purely down to the shaping on the back and the padding. Now I'm adding some leather straps, which are their leather belt blanks ordered from eBay. Now I'm not particularly happy with these straps because the leather belt blanks I used in this case they had like a shinier finish to the ones I'd normally use, and I'm not 100% happy with them. I may end up changing them. It depends how noticeable it is sort of when I assemble the whole outfit. Now one mistake I did make here is that I actually put these on the wrong way round. So in terms of which side the buckles were on and which side the non-buckle side was, it led to like a piece of leather that sort of stuck up as I wore it. So I ended up having to take them off and swap them round, but that's not shown in the video. But just something to bear in mind if you're going to build a backpack like this is take a look at an existing backpack and just see which side the buckles are on, which side the buckles aren't on, because it does make a difference in terms of how it actually sits when you wear it. So this is the other half, just cutting the curved sort of ends of the leather straps, and then I'll be punching some holes with a hole punch. Don't really want this to turn into a video on leather working. There's a lot of people who do leather working an awful lot better than I do. I generally can sort of bumble my way through it enough to do a build, especially if the main focus of it isn't leather work. But yeah, there's a lot of people do it a lot better than me. So I'm just now attaching various components, so the crank generator, the cyclotron and some other bits there to the side that you've not seen me assemble, but they're all just made using the same technique. Using some slot-headed screws, that's just a pet peeve of mine. I don't like seeing exposed posi drive screws on stuff that's supposed to look old. So now we're making something called the booster, which is like a circular element up at the top, which I'm cutting down here and sanding down a piece of MDF to make a stand for an aluminium water bottle, then adding a top using the base from a plastic wine glass, and then I'll be adding rivets. Now one thing to note with these water bottles is if might come in handy for a few people for their builds is that the cap thread on these sort of cheapy aluminium water bottles is virtually identical to a 3/4 inch British standard plumbing thread. So you can thread in pipe fittings into the neck of these water bottles, which is exactly what I do here. I thread in like an old brass radiator valve. But yeah, just painting it the same way as the cyclotron with the cast iron effect, because I'm just trying to bring a bit of uniformity to the whole pack. So I did the dry brushing as well. I don't think I captured that on video, but I did do the dry brushing with the lighter silvery colour, then lacquered it. As you can see, it's now got a shine on it, and added the boiler cladding. Same method again, lollipop sticks, glued on with contact adhesive, though no worries about the glue on this because it's aluminium underneath. Then I do add eventually the copper banding using the copper tape again. So yeah, adding the copper banding there, just 2 layers of copper tape, and you'll see it looks quite similar to the look of the cyclotron, which is what I wanted. It's to try and just tie this whole thing together, make it look a bit more of a uniform whole rather than just an assemblage of bits. So then we need a connection to the neutrino wand. So there's electrics that run between the pack and the neutrino wand, and I did this by making like a steam hose, which I've done before. Technique I use is to take either a copper pipe or a broom handle or something else circular, wrap gaffer tape round it sticky side out, then wrap this, which is just like a plastic coated garden wire. Any wire would do, it's just I can get that easily in very long lengths very cheaply. Then I'm adding this stuff, which is a cloth sports injury tape. Now, this is something that I used to get from Pound World, but I can't find. I have a lot of it in stock, sort of stockpiled, but I don't know where I can get it from anymore. So it is gradually diminishing the more builds I do with these sort of steam hoses on. But you can see it makes sort of quite an effective, flexible hose. Now I ran the wires down the centre of the copper pipe as the easiest way of getting it in, and now you've got essentially a hose with a whole bunch of wires down the centre of it. Just added a copper pipe elbow to the end of it, and this is to go into just I think it's just a compression joint, which I'm just doing as you would any plumbing compression joint, just tightening it up first finger tight, and then get the positioning how I wanted it, and then just clinch it down with a spanner. It's got an olive in there, so this isn't going to go anywhere once it's tightened up. Now the electrics in this, there's far more wires running to the neutrino one than it really needs at the moment, and that's because I wanted to leave it open for the option of putting an Arduino in it later if I ever wanted to. But at the moment it's very basic. There's no microcontroller in this. It's all just switches turning things on and off. So the cyclotron lights are 3 LEDs, a flicker flame, a red and a white. The flicker flame and the red are on all the time as soon as you turn the Proton pack on, and they give like quite a nice firebox effect. Then when you flick the what I'm calling the arming switch on the neutrino wand, that turns the bright white LED on and makes it look like you're sort of running a blower and burning these fireboxes white hot. So I'm now adding the individual fireboxes into the cyclotron with hot glue. I've put some little glass windows in using some circular bits of glass that I had. I think they're from old halogen spotlights. Then I'm adding just a piece of black cardboard over the back just so you can't see. There is a little bit of coal put over those LEDs to make it look like a firebox. Now we're building the ion arm lights. Again, same principle, far more wires in here than there needs to be, but that's to give me the option if I wanted to add a chasing effect or something later. At the moment they're just static on, mounted inside a plastic test tube, which is one of the novelty ones you get from bars and things, and then feeding that wiring into the copper sort of coils of that electric shower element, pulling it down, pulling the test tube into place, and then I just sort of fix that in place with a bit of super glue. That's all it needs. It's quite well protected there inside the copper coils. Just do a test run on it. Nice bright blue LEDs in that. So now we're adding a motor for the crank generator. This is to spin that clock mechanism. Now, I like using salvage motors from cassette players and VCRs because they generally run a lot quieter than the sort of cheapy motors you get off eBay. They are a far higher quality motor, and they say because of that they do run quite quiet. So that's the motor mounted in, and then I'm adding the switch there on to the crank generator and this sort of spaghetti junction of wiring, which is where I connect the USB port. So now we need to route the wiring from the ion arm through to the crank generator, which I'm just routing through some copper pipe, cutting it to size as I go. You can see there's not really any precise measurement here, it's just sort of getting it to what looks right so it fits on the back of the pack. And then we'll have to drill a hole for those wires, which we do now, so that that can all be routed through. And a lot of the connections are inside that crank generator, and the rest of the connections are in the cyclotron. The ribbon cable in between is made up of cores from like a sample pack of cloth covered cable, which I unwound so that I've got lots of different colours to make up the colourful ribbon cable, but all in like old looking cloth covered cable. Now, one of the reasons for using real cable for this is because, again, if I did add that Arduino later, it gives me those cable pairs to run functions between the crank generator and the cyclotron. Now I'm just running that ribbon cable through this, which is a sash window pull. It's just a nice little sort of brass circular lump to hold it in place, feeding all of that cable through. You can see I've notched out the side of the crank generator there, and I did also notch out the cyclotron to run this in. Just putting some terminal block onto the two sort of cables that I'm actually, the two cores of that cable I'm using, and then connecting up the electrics at both ends. It's at the crank generator end, just sort of connecting everything up into that terminal block. I generally like using terminal block on anything I might have to work on in the future. It's far easier than trying to desolder things. But then we're adding just some final details, just a big old relay, and I think we add a few bits of copper pipe. But yeah, this is pretty much it done. I'll just probably stick some photos on the end of this of just me wearing the pack with some green screened in backgrounds, so you can have a look what the whole thing looks like put together. So please like, subscribe, follow my channel, follow me on social media. I do quite a lot of these builds. I don't think I'm never going to do another Steampunk Proton pack, but I do a lot of builds. I am trying to do more build logs for YouTube, so if you like this kind of content, please follow my channel. Thank you very much. Bye.